So they started talking about the staffing problem. I just like to clarify and say that I misspoke about the staffing problem. We don't need more. This isn't going to require more funding or any more staff. And then the next thing I'd like to say is that, so they said that SHU are being allowed family visits, but you can tag my responses. The BOP keeps its plans in the dark. The BOP keeps its plans in the dark. Professor Walter Pavlo published by Forbes in July 2021. Quote, the BOP disclosed on its website the number of inmates placed on home confinement since March 2020. That number was an impressive and deceiving 25,000. However, the BOP was forced to admit that the number included those who would have been on home confinement anyway, and few of those released under CARES Act. The real CARES Act number was 4,400. The BOP gives fake information and lies frequently, so we can't be relying on these statistics. The next thing is that they started talking about how we need to solve our harm, but again, our plan is a comparative advantage, and meaning if our advantages can outweigh the disadvantages, we best deserve your value. So again, it's a comparative advantage case, not where we have to solve our harm. And then the next thing is that they said that they said that their reform requires staff, and you can check my responses. Already have visitation rooms. You see, we already have visitation rooms for the general population prison, so we aren't going to be needing more rooms or whatever, because we already have the visitation rooms, and we're going to be using the exact same visitation rooms. And then the next thing is all these problems, you see, all are on this one staff argument. So as we can see here, that the BOP always keeps its plans in the dark. How actually our plan is a comparative advantage case, so we aren't going to be losing this, or we shouldn't really. They don't deserve your ballot if we can't solve our harm, because our case is a comparative advantage case. And then the last thing is that we already have visitation problems, and for all these reasons, I urge the affirmative ballot. It's been a pleasure speaking.
We have 2 minutes and 33 seconds of prep time. We're going to go ahead and start that now.
can't have safety, you can't have a lot of things that make prisons operate without proper staffing. This piece of evidence from the Associated Press, May 21st, 2021, is true of the affirmative teams plan. Well, I know that the affirmative team came up in their last speech and said they don't need staff. I think it's quite obvious that they do. You see, as they admitted in their upper speech, and it made sense to me, at least at the time, in order to have more visitation, you need staff to either have more hours to actually work with these inmates and make sure and monitor them, or you need to hire new staff. And whether or not they agree to it, I think this is a logical argument that can be made. Of course they need more staff. In today's speech, I'm going to be doing two things. First, we're going to go ahead and respond to all those arguments you heard from Henry in his last speech. Before, at the end of today's speech, I'm going to be going into three voting issues. Ultimately, why the big problems we brought up with their plan should make you vote negative. But that aside, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first statement he said was that we don't need more staff. Well, first of all, I don't understand the argument at all. He basically said we don't need staff, but he didn't actually give a logical argument. At least I didn't hear him make a logical argument about why they don't need staff. He just came and he said that they don't need staff. In team policy debate, you make an argument with either logic or evidence, but you don't come here and just say you don't need staff. That at least for me, did not make any sense. But there's two worlds. Either they don't need staff, and these visitations are completely unmonitored, which is a whole list of disadvantages in and of itself. If they're unmonitored, then people can give them drugs, they can escape. If it's unmonitored, all those disadvantages I talked about with lack of staffing all apply to the affirmative team still. But if they are taking staff, those disadvantages still apply. Why? Because if you're taking staff away and not hiring new staff, then guess what? You're going to be taking the staff that are doing the bare essentials, like the cooks and nurses that are having to guard inmates in the current facilities, and putting them for these visitations. Whatever the affirmative team decides, whether or not they need staff or they don't need staff, either way, there's going to be disadvantages, and actually the exact same disadvantages either way. His next argument was that the Bureau of Prison lies, and that they're not trustworthy. So if they say that there isn't solitary confinement, then we shouldn't trust them. Well, guess what? I agree. And guess what? The Bureau of Prisons will probably lie about the affirmative team's plan. If they're so good at lying about everything that they do and every piece of enforcement, then what's for us to believe that they won't lie about the affirmative team's plan? The real enforcement. How do we know that the affirmative team's plan will actually happen? That argument actually just hurts himself in the foot. Because if they say the Bureau of Prison will lie about anything about solitary confinements, then why would they not lie about the affirmative team's plan? There's no enforcement for the affirmative team's plan if you make this argument. Let's go ahead and go into his next argument. He went on to talk about how they're going to be using the same rooms, and that since they're going to use the same rooms, we don't need any staff. That's not true. I mean, yes, of course you can use the same rooms, and that's besides the point. Maybe there's enough rooms for it. But you can't just have empty rooms and no staff. That argument kind of falls apart whenever you actually look at what you need, which is staff. He went on to say that their case is comparative advantage. Guess what? I also agree. But what you do need to look at a comparative case is not only look at the disadvantages that we're presenting, which I believe are massive and reasons enough to vote for the negative team, but you also have to look about whether or not their plan is actually needed. With the affirmative team, there is no reason to pass their plan, because guess what? People housed in SHU, what their mandate plan text says, they already have those visitation hours. But before I go into my voting issues, let's go address a couple of arguments that were key arguments that were dropped in the last speech. Simply that of COVID isolation, my partner's last argument about how this is COVID isolation, not actually solitary confinement, that we already have. He completely dropped the argument about SHUs already having these visitation hours, and the whole argument about punishment, that this is a idea that we should punish prisoners, and they've broken these rules specifically that said if you break this rule, you will not get family visitation. He dropped all those arguments. But with that, let's go into my voting issue. Voting issue 1, staffing. Staffing is important. With the affirmative team's plan, whichever perspective you take on the affirmative team's plan, staffing is a big issue. You'll be taking staffing, causing more riots, more violence, more jail breaks. My second voting issue, arguably the most important, is that the affirmative team's plan we already have, or we already have. It's simple. I read the evidence from the Bureau of Prisons from 2016, which literally said that they have minimum 4 hours of visitation per month. That's family visitation. It already exists. No need for the affirmative team's plan. And my final voting issue is that of no enforcement. If the BOP lies about everything else, why would they lie about the affirmative team's plan? In conclusion, if you vote affirmative, while you think there might be some advantages, ultimately, the affirmative team's case when diagnosed, does not treat the problem,